Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the question of whether or not Canada has a legal obligation to repatriate Canadian citizens who fought for ISIS and are currently being held in Kurdish prisons in northeast Syria. Now, Brian, one of the things I'm interested in this case, because the courts found there was an obligation to repatriate these four Canadians who fought for ISIS, these four men. But how is this case different from the case related to Omar Khadr? In Khadr's case, the Supreme Court actually stopped short of ordering the government to seek Khadr's return to Canada. And I acknowledge the circumstances are different, but Khadr was actually a minor when he was captured in Afghanistan. These men obviously were not. But other differences are that I think that the conditions in northeast Syria have been described in quite severe terms. But so were the conditions in Guantanamo Bay, although different. And there's also a difference in the governments that are holding him. The American government was holding Mr. Khadr, whereas it's actually a non-government entity that is holding these four Canadians in northeast Syria. So how did that reasoning in the Khadr case play into the decision in the case of these four men?
Yeah, I think the primary factor that distinguishes Khadr from this case is called the Bolo case, for Bring Our Loved Ones Home, Bolo. The key difference that differentiates Khadr from Bolo is the level of involvement in the Canadian government in the Khadr facts. So the court found that CSIS and I believe RCMP, but certainly CSIS, intelligence services, interviewed Omar Khadr while he was in custody, and then the Canadian government, turned that information over to the American government. And that act of interrogating and then turning the information over, the court found that Canada was constructively involved in an ongoing process that was continuing to violate Omar Khadr's substantial rights. And so that was the key, was that the Canadian government was directly involved, or at least involved enough in the process for the court to find Canadian involvement and responsibility kind of by proxy. So that's the Khadr case. And then the facts here in Bolo are that the Canadian government has been involved very little. And so there's no indication, at least on the record, that the Canadian government has interviewed the detainees or given any intelligence over to the folks, the group that's holding them.
Right.
And so
although
because there's a lack,
Brian, if they are repatriating the women who are not
yeah,
necessarily victims in this case, and some of them I think would face criminal charges when they are repatriated, if they have a
yeah,
process in place for some of these detainees in Syria, how do you say that there's no process for the men? If it's just the
well,
government picking and choosing who they're going to create a process for?
with the policy framework that we mentioned, I believe in the first segment, so the government came up with that framework, and then they're applying the framework that they've created. And so they've, based on the factors that the government has developed, they've decided, this group. And my understanding is that the government was reluctant to repatriate basically anybody, but then they faced pressure as the legal proceeding developed in the federal court, that there's a possibility that the court was going to direct the government to request repatriation of everybody. And so I think the government's trying to strike kind of a middle ground here and say, okay, we will take the women and children off the table at this in the judicial process by requesting their repatriation.
Okay.
And then that leaves just these four males to deal with in the judicial process.
I want to get Phil in. Phil, we've got about a minute in this segment. Anything you want to add to that difference that I think a lot of Canadians might have in their minds between the Khadr case, where the Trudeau government was really adamant in advocating for Mr. Khadr, saying the charter applies to all Canadians, and this case, what makes them different for you?
Again, I can't speak to the legal issues, Christine. Obviously, Guantanamo plays big in this. Guantanamo was a mistake by the Americans, in my opinion, since 9/11. But I also want to point out that, Brian mentioned that CSIS, and I know the CSIS officer who went to interview Omar Khadr. Had we not interviewed Omar Khadr, we would not have been doing our duty as national security. He was the son of a lieutenant of Al Qaeda. We needed to know what he knew about possible threats to Canada. So CSIS was doing its job. That was interpreted as violating Khadr's rights. Again, I can't speak to the legal part.
Right.
But as a Canadian, I would hope my security service was taking advantage of as much information as possible to determine threats to national security.
We've got to go to break, but we will be right back.